I've always loved hiking. The solitude, the sound of the wind through the trees, the crunch of dirt beneath my boots. It's my way of escaping the chaos of the world. That's why, a few months ago, I decided to spend a long weekend in the mountains. There was a trail I'd been meaning to try, one that cut deep into an old-growth forest a few hours from my home in Oregon. The first day was uneventful. I started early, parked at the trailhead, and spent hours winding through towering pines and moss-covered rocks. I didn't see another soul, which was just how I liked it. The air was crisp, the kind of sharp cold that stings your lungs in the best way. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing where I set up camp. It was perfect, secluded and quiet, with a small stream nearby. As I was pitching my tent, I noticed something odd. A pile of stones stacked neatly at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't unusual to see cairns marking trails, but this one felt out of place. The stones weren't balanced like a hiker would leave them. They were arranged in a spiral, almost like a child's drawing of a snail. I shook off the unease and chalked it up to some artistic camper's handiwork. By nightfall, I had a fire going, and the strange stone spiral was long forgotten. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Just nothing. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was like someone whispering, just outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The whispering stopped. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint shadows on the trees. That's when I saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, her back to me. She was tall and thin, her hair hanging in wet, dark strands down her back. She wore a tattered white dress that looked stained with mud. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't move, didn't turn around. She just stood there, motionless. I crawled out of the tent, flashlight in hand, and took a cautious step toward her. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. I was about 10 feet away when she finally moved. Slowly, she tilted her head to the side, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. And then she turned around. Her face was wrong. It wasn't just pale. It was waxy, like a mannequin. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and completely black. No whites, no pupils, just endless voids. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "What the hell?" she smiled. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. Then she started walking toward me. I froze, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. She kept coming, her steps slow and deliberate, her head still tilted at that unnatural angle. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. I swung the flashlight beam wildly, hoping it might deter her, but she didn't flinch. Finally, my legs caught up with my brain. I turned and bolted toward the trail. The beam of my flashlight bounced erratically, illuminating flashes of trees and dirt as I ran. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't dare look back. The trail was harder to navigate in the dark, but I didn't care about twisting an ankle or getting lost. I just needed to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. After what felt like an eternity, I stopped to catch my breath. I leaned against a tree, my chest heaving, and dared to glance behind me. The trail was empty. For a moment, I thought I'd lost her. Then I heard it, the whispering. It was faint, but unmistakable. A soft, sibilant murmur, like dozens of voices speaking at once. It wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from all around me. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but the light only revealed empty trunks and tangled undergrowth. Still, the whispering grew louder, closer, and then I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the trail, maybe 20 feet away, just as still and silent as before. But this time, she wasn't alone. There were others. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, stepping out from behind the trees. Men, women, even children. All of them pale, with those same black, bottomless eyes. They didn't move like people. Their motions were jerky, stuttering, like puppets on tangled strings. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran again, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The whispering rose to a crescendo, echoing in my head. I don't remember how long I ran. At some point, I tripped and fell, the flashlight skittering out of my hand. I scrambled to grab it, and when I turned it back on, I realized I was back in the clearing. The spiral of stones was in front of me, but it wasn't just stones anymore. The spiral was filled with bones. Human bones. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The whispering was so loud now, it felt like it was inside my skull. And then I heard her voice. "You shouldn't have come here." It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry, but it was colder than the night air, and it froze me in place. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was lying on the trail near the parking lot. My gear was gone, and my body was covered in scratches, like I'd been dragged through the woods. I went to the ranger station, but I didn't tell them what happened. What could I say? That I saw a ghost? A demon? They wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believe it myself. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back into those woods. I grew up in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing exciting ever happened. Our next-door neighbors, the Hendersons, were nice enough, polite, but private. Mr. Henderson worked nights, and Mrs. Henderson was rarely seen outside the house. They didn't have kids, so they mostly kept to themselves. When I was 12, I became friends with a boy down the street named Mark. Mark was the adventurous type, always looking for something to do, and he had a knack for getting into trouble. One summer evening, we were hanging out in my backyard when he leaned in and said, "Have you ever seen the Hendersons' basement?" I laughed. "No, why would I? It's just a basement." Mark grinned. "I heard it's not just a basement. My brother says they're hiding something down there. Weird stuff." I rolled my eyes. "Like what?" He shrugged, clearly enjoying the mystery. "I don't know. Bodies? Some kind of secret lab? We should check it out." I should have said no. I should have told him to drop it. But I was 12, and the idea of sneaking into the mysterious Hendersons' house was too exciting to pass up. That night, we waited until the Hendersons' lights went out. Mark had somehow managed to find a spare key to their back door. Don't ask me how, and before I knew it, we were creeping into their house. It was eerily quiet inside. The air felt thick, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the hallways. We tiptoed through the kitchen and down a narrow staircase to the basement door. Mark tried the handle, and to my surprise, it wasn't locked. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a steep, dark staircase. "Let's go," Mark whispered, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I hesitated, but he was already halfway down the stairs. Reluctantly, I followed. The basement was larger than I expected, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with old tools and jars filled with murky liquids. But that wasn't the weird part. In the center of the room was a circle made of salt, and within the circle, there was a strange symbol drawn in what looked like dried blood. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, my stomach churning. Mark crouched down, examining the symbol. "Looks like some kind of ritual, like witchcraft or something." We both jumped as a loud thud echoed from the far corner of the basement. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" I hissed. Mark nodded, his bravado suddenly gone. "Yeah, let's check it out." I wanted to leave, but Mark was already moving toward the sound. I followed, my heart pounding. We found an old wooden cabinet, its door slightly ajar. The thud came again, louder this time, as if something was trying to get out. "There's something in there," Mark whispered. "No kidding," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. Before I could stop him, Mark yanked the cabinet door open, and then everything went wrong. Inside the cabinet was a box, small and unassuming, made of dark wood. It didn't seem like it could have made the thudding noise we'd heard, but the air around it felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark reached out, his hand trembling slightly. "Only one way to find out." "Don't," I said, but it was too late. He opened the box. At first, I thought it was empty. Then I noticed the inside was lined with strange symbols carved into the wood, similar to the one on the floor. And in the center of the box was a small, black object, a stone, or something like it, but it seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the dim light. The moment Mark picked it up, the temperature in the room dropped. The air felt colder than a freezer, and my breath came out in visible puffs. "We need to put that back," I said, my voice rising in panic. Mark stared at the object in his hand, his eyes wide. I can't." "What do you mean, you can't?" His face twisted in confusion and fear. "It's stuck." Before I could say anything else, the thudding noise started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the cabinet. It was coming from the walls. The sound grew louder, echoing through the basement, until it felt like the whole house was shaking. And then, all at once, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Mark dropped the object back into the box and slammed the lid shut. "Let's get out of here." We turned to leave, but the basement door was no longer at the top of the stairs. Instead, there was a solid concrete wall where the door had been. "What the hell?" I shouted, my voice trembling. Mark grabbed my arm. "There's got to be another way out. Come on." We started searching frantically, but the basement seemed to stretch on endlessly. The walls and shelves were shifting, rearranging themselves like a maze. The salt circle was gone, replaced by more of those symbols, glowing faintly on the floor. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere behind us. "Run!" Mark screamed. I didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted through the maze of shelves and symbols, the growling growing louder and closer with every step. I could feel something chasing us, its presence heavy and suffocating. I didn't dare look back. Finally, we stumbled into a small alcove where an old, rusted ladder led up to a hatch. Mark scrambled up first, pushing the hatch open, and I followed close behind. We burst out into the backyard, gasping for air. The Hendersons' house was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Without a word, we ran back to my house and locked the door behind us. We didn't speak about what we'd seen. Not to each other, not to anyone. A few days later, I noticed a moving truck at the Hendersons' house. By the time I worked up the courage to ask my mom about it, the neighbors were gone. No goodbyes, no explanations, just gone. Mark and I drifted apart after that. I think we were both too scared to talk about what happened, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that thudding noise in my dreams. And every time I do, I wonder, did we bring something back with us? I've worked as a rideshare driver for about 5 years now. The hours are long, but it pays the bills, and you get to meet all kinds of interesting people. But one night, about a year ago, I picked up a passenger I'll never forget. It was a Thursday, and I just finished a late-night airport run. It was around 2 a.m., and I was debating whether to call it a night when a new request popped up. The pickup was at a gas station on the outskirts of town. A bit sketchy, but not unusual. When I pulled into the lot, I didn't see anyone at first. The station was empty, the neon, open 24 hours, sign flickering weakly in the darkness. I rolled down my window and called out, "You call a ride?" A man emerged from the shadows near the payphone. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild night. As he approached, I noticed his face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were bloodshot. He climbed into the back seat without saying a word. Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He handed me a piece of paper with an address scrawled on it. It was about 30 minutes away, deep in a rural area I wasn't familiar with. "Okay," I said, punching the address into my GPS. "Buckle up." The man didn't respond, but I heard the faint click of the seatbelt. As we pulled onto the road, I tried to make small talk. "Late night, huh? Coming from work or?" Silence. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, his face blank. "All right, no problem," I muttered, focusing on the road. The drive was uneventful at first. The city lights faded behind us, and the highway stretched into darkness. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. About 15 minutes in, my GPS announced a turn onto a narrow, unpaved road. The trees closed in on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, glancing at the rearview mirror. The man's reflection was gone. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. Turning around, I found him still sitting there, staring at me with those bloodshot eyes. "Don't stop," he said, his voice low and hoarse. I swallowed hard and kept driving. The road grew rougher, the car jostling over rocks and potholes. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were going nowhere. The GPS screen was blank now, the address completely erased. "We're almost there," the man said suddenly, breaking the silence. I didn't respond. I just wanted to drop him off and get the hell out of there. Finally, the trees parted, and I saw a dilapidated house at the end of the road. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges. "This is it," he said. I stopped the car and waited for him to get out, but he didn't move. The man just sat there, staring at the house. The longer he stayed, the more the air inside the car felt wrong, thick, suffocating. "Are you getting out?" I asked, my voice shaky. He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I noticed something truly unsettling. His eyes weren't just bloodshot. They looked empty, like the blood vessels had burst, leaving nothing but red where the whites should have been. "Not yet," he said. I clenched the steering wheel, my instincts screaming at me to leave. "Listen, man, I've got other rides to get to. If you're not going to wait here," he interrupted, his tone flat. Then he opened the door and stepped out. I watched as he walked toward the house, his movements slow and deliberate. The night was eerily quiet. No wind, no insects, just silence. The man reached the porch and stopped. He stood there for a moment, staring at the crooked door, before stepping inside. I exhaled, relieved to be alone, but I didn't feel safe. Something about the house, about him, felt wrong. I glanced at the time. 5 minutes passed. 10. "All right, screw this," I muttered, shifting the car into reverse. As soon as I started backing up, the man reappeared in the doorway. He wasn't walking anymore. He was running, his arms outstretched, his mouth open in a silent scream. I floored it. The car lurched backward onto the dirt road, the tires skidding on loose gravel. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel him. Close, too close. The rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness, and yet, I knew he was there. The unpaved road stretched endlessly, my GPS still blank. My chest tightened as the trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at the car. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chase stopped. The road smoothed out, the trees parted, and I found myself back on the highway. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. My heart pounded as I pulled over onto the shoulder. The silence in the car was deafening. I turned on the interior light and checked the back seat. Nothing. Breathing heavily, I opened the rideshare app to report the trip, but there was no record of it. No request, no passenger, no trip. It was as if it had never happened. I drove home in a daze, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. For weeks after, I avoided late-night rides. I told myself it was just a glitch, a bad dream. But every now and then, I still see that address flash in my mind. And sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice. Wait here. I've always been drawn to antique shops. There's something fascinating about objects with history, the feeling that they've seen lives and stories long before yours. So, when I stumbled across a quaint little shop in the city, tucked between a boarded-up cafe and a dry cleaner, I couldn't resist stepping inside. The place was packed with old furniture, dusty books, and tarnished silverware. As I browsed, something caught my eye in the corner. A tall, ornate mirror with a gilded frame. The mirror was beautiful, but there was something about it that felt off. The glass wasn't quite reflective. Instead, it seemed to absorb the light around it, giving everything a faint, dull glow. How much for the mirror? I asked the shopkeeper, an older man with tired eyes. He hesitated. That one? It's, not for sale. I raised an eyebrow. Why not? It's just old. Doesn't work right, he muttered, avoiding my gaze. But I was hooked. The more he resisted, the more I wanted it. Come on, everything's got a price. He sighed and named a figure far lower than I expected. I handed him the cash, and with his help, managed to fit the mirror into the back of my car. When I got it home, I decided to put it in my bedroom. It was heavy and awkward to move, but I eventually propped it up against the wall opposite my bed. That night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A movement. I turned toward the mirror, but all I saw was my reflection, dim and distorted as usual. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, and went to sleep. But the dream started that night. In the dream, I was standing in front of the mirror. Except it wasn't my room. The surroundings were unfamiliar, dark and shadowy. My reflection stared back at me, but it didn't move when I did. It smiled. I woke up in a cold sweat. The image burned into my mind. Over the next few days, the strange feeling around the mirror grew stronger. Every time I passed it, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. Then, one evening, as I was brushing my hair in front of the mirror, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The reflection behind me wasn't my bedroom. It was that dark, shadowy place from my dream. I froze, my eyes locked on the glass. Slowly, I turned to look behind me. My bedroom was there, just as it should be. But when I looked back at the mirror, the shadowy room remained. My reflection smiled again, and then it moved. The reflection in the mirror tilted its head, studying me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't copying my movements. It was acting on its own. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering. The room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the reflection was gone. The glass showed only my room, dimly lit by the bedside lamp. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window made me jump. By morning, I convinced myself it was a hallucination, a product of stress or lack of sleep. But things only got worse. Over the next few days, I started seeing shadows flickering in the mirror. Quick, darting movements that disappeared when I looked directly at them. Objects in my room would appear in different places in the reflection, as if the mirror was showing a slightly different version of my life. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe the wind or a passing car. But as I sat up, I realized the sound was coming from the mirror. The glass was glowing faintly, a sickly green light pulsating from its depths. I stared, frozen, as shapes began to emerge, twisted, shadowy figures that writhed and shifted behind the glass. One of them stepped closer, pressing its hand against the surface. The glass rippled like water, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it might break through. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the mirror. The lamp shattered on impact, but the mirror remained intact. The figures inside began to laugh, a sound that sent chills down my spine. I didn't know what else to do. I threw on a jacket, grabbed my keys, and fled the house. For the next 2 nights, I stayed with a friend, too afraid to go back. When I finally worked up the courage to return, I found the mirror lying face down on the floor. I should have smashed it right then and there, but something stopped me. Instead, I covered it with a sheet and shoved it into the basement. I thought that would be the end of it, but the dream started again. I kept seeing the shadowy figures, the twisted room, and my reflection, always smiling. A few weeks later, I woke up to find the mirror back in my bedroom, the sheet neatly folded on the floor. I don't know how it got there. I live alone. Now, I can't escape it. No matter where I move it, the mirror always finds its way back. I've tried everything, smashing it, burning it, even burying it, but it won't go away. And every night, when I look into the glass, I see my reflection smiling, but it's not me. I was driving home late one night after visiting my parents in the next town over. It was a 2-hour trip along a quiet, winding highway that cut through miles of farmland and dense woods. The kind of road where you barely see another car, especially past midnight. I didn't mind driving at night, though. There was something calming about the empty road, the way my headlights illuminated the asphalt and the trees blurred into a wall of shadow. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. At first, it was just a feeling, a prickling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or a pair of glowing eyes, but the road behind me was empty. I shook it off and turned up the radio, trying to drown out the creeping unease. A few minutes later, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the road. It was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a dark coat. The headlights didn't catch much detail, but something about the way it stood, perfectly still, facing the road, sent a chill down my spine. I slowed down as I approached, thinking it might be someone who needed help, but as I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't moving at all. No attempt to wave me down, no reaction to my car. When I finally passed it, I turned to get a better look. There was no one there. My heart raced as I stared at the empty shoulder. I tried to rationalize it, a shadow, a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I kept driving, gripping the wheel tightly, my eyes scanning the road ahead. For a while, nothing happened. The highway stretched on, dark and silent, and I started to convince myself it was all in my head. Then I saw the figure again. This time, it was in the middle of the road, far ahead in the glow of my high beams. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly as it came to a stop. The figure stood motionless, staring directly at me. I honked the horn, my chest tight with fear and frustration. "Move!" I shouted, as if it could hear me. It didn't budge. As I sat there, frozen, I noticed something deeply wrong. The figure's shadow stretched in the wrong direction, bending away from the headlights instead of toward them. The longer I looked, the less human it seemed. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid, and then it started walking toward me. It didn't walk like a person. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as though it didn't understand how its body was supposed to work. I panicked, slamming the car into reverse and backing up as fast as I could. The figure kept coming, its pace steady, unhurried. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I tried to think rationally, call someone, turn the car around, do anything. But my hands were shaking too much to even grab my phone. The figure stopped. It stood there, illuminated by my headlights, its head tilted slightly as if it were watching me. And then it started to change. Its outline began to ripple, like heat waves rising off asphalt in the summer. The edges of its form blurred, twisting into something impossible. The the head elongated, the limbs stretched, and its torso seemed to split open, revealing a dark, hollow void. The air in the car grew heavy, almost suffocating, as if the figure were draining the space around it. I snapped out of my paralysis and threw the car into drive, swerving back onto the road and speeding past it. My tires screeched as I accelerated, the rearview mirror showing nothing but the empty highway. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then I saw it again. This time, it was right next to the car, running alongside me. It wasn't possible. I was doing at least 60 miles per hour, but there it was, its distorted form keeping pace effortlessly. Its face, or what was left of it, turned toward me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like my body was screaming at me to look away. I didn't. I couldn't. Its hollow eyes seemed to pierce through me, and for a moment, I felt as though I was falling into that dark void, my mind unraveling. The car jolted as one of the tires hit something on the road, snapping me out of whatever trance it had put me in. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over, my entire body trembling. When I looked out the window, the figure was gone. The road was silent, empty, as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait to figure out what was going on. I floored it, driving as fast as I dared, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirrors. By the time I reached the lights of the next town, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I pulled into a gas station and parked under the bright fluorescent lights, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for my heartbeat to return to normal. Eventually, I worked up the courage to get out of the car. As I walked toward the gas station door, I glanced at my car's windows, and I froze. There was a handprint on the driver's side window, smeared as though someone, or something, had dragged its fingers down the glass. I didn't go back for the rest of the trip. I don't even take that highway anymore. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I catch glimpses of movement in my rearview mirror. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting,